we talk about this idea of how fast can the earth regenerate itself. There's really interesting studies about this. We suck through about a year's worth of earth, usually in about 8 months every year. So we're just burning through all of our resources faster than they can replenish. So we got to shift the onus onto the supply side to say, nope, show that this was sustainable, show that this was legal, show that your workers were treated fairly. We've got to enhance the oversight that we're doing here. If, business as usual ain't going to cut it.
Hello, Bradley. Hi.
Hey, Bradley.
I'm in the right place. I'm not crashing a Zoom call accidentally here.
No,
you are, but you're crashing the right Zoom call.
Yeah.
All right, good.
Bradley, did you always love the ocean?
I grew up on Chesapeake Bay in Maryland, on the Eastern Shore, next to a commercial marina. And so, I look back now and there's a very clear line, but at the time it was like, well, okay. Like, I live next to the water, I go hang out with commercial fishermen after, when I'm a little kid wandering around the docks, kind of makes more sense. But at the time, it wasn't some deep and abiding love of the ocean. It was just where we were and where I grew up. Although I should say I now live in the part of the UK that is literally about as far from the ocean as you can get. So I'm not doing a very good job of staying by the ocean.
So I want to ask how you go from you're hanging out on the docks at the bay or whatever, Otis Redding. Okay. But then you kind of get on this path of really being with the ocean. And then now you're in this incredible place of like saving the ocean. So how does that journey go?
Yeah, a bit of luck and a bit of requirement. So I went to the U.S. Coast Guard Academy. The great thing there is it's free. So that was a compelling argument for where I was for my undergraduate. At the time, I was interested in a marine biology program that I actually didn't end up doing because I liked history and government studies more, which has actually served me better than even the marine biology program did, I would think. It just kind of like was a series of events where it was just sort of following the path of interest. And then my first job out of the academy, when you're leaving, they tell everybody, okay, there's 100 and, how many of us graduated? Like 130, 140 of us graduated. They say, here's the jobs, ask for your top 3. And then they basically do this sort of magic thing. And it's all this very stressful, like, oh, am I going to get Key West? Am I going to get San Diego? And it's very like, people are so worried about it. And I was like, talked to my roommate and I was like, man, I hate worrying about this for like 4 months. So I was like, how about Kodiak? Because nobody asks for Alaska.
Yeah.
And so we both just put in knowing we get it, and we got it. Yeah. And I ended up with a really good skipper on my first ship who was really into fisheries conservation and fisheries compliance. And really, I didn't realize that was a career path I could take, but he's the one who set me up on it and pointed the way and showed me what we could do. It was really fun. And that was just blind luck. So.
Now you started with conservation. I mean, what's the major problem you're solving now?
Well, right now I'm gainfully unemployed, so I left the organization I co-founded just about a month ago. So I helped set that up for over about 6 years or so, but focused on ocean conservation and through compliance and understanding human activity. And so in that particular role, and what we set up the organization to do and what it still does very well is about bringing together big data and advanced analysis. So making humans better at understanding what's happening out on the ocean with all of the data that's available. That's a lot of satellite data, but it's also stuff that comes from governments and from industry to identify where there are problems or trends that might require a response in the future, which is really a big issue for all of life. We're just drowning in data, and there's not necessarily the tools or the people around to make it possible, especially in sort of poor, underserved areas of governance like fisheries or ocean conservation.
You talk about governance, fisheries or, the ocean isn't, who owns the ocean and how do you advocate for a certain specific part of the ocean?
Yeah, it is the question. It is darn hard. So technically speaking, the fish out to 200 miles from shore belong to that country, and they belong to all of us. So speaking as American, I assume you all are Americans, all of the fish within 200 miles of American shores are American fish. Same go, assuming there's not another country that where you have a shared boundary kind of thing. We're just,
right.
As the crow flies, or as the seagull flies, we should say. But what ends up happening is that the sort of resource users are the ones who are most involved in deciding what is sustainable. So you end up with a bias towards extraction, towards catching more fish in the system. Now, the plus side of that is that those people, fishers are very knowledgeable and have a vested stake in making sure that fish is there in the future. But humans are very good at killing a lot of fish very fast. We have a good track record in some areas, Alaskan salmon, pollock, some others. America actually has a very good track record on, and is a very good federal law at the federal level. The states vary tremendously.
Now, aren't we good with salmon in Alaska, but not so good with it, down here in the lower 48 on the coast here? Like, we've sort of fished out the salmon in a way, haven't we?
Well, fished out and built hydroelectric dams.
Right.
I mean, that's the story of the East Coast too. We wanted good carbon-free electricity. We didn't care as much about the carbon-free element at the time, and we dammed up most of the rivers, and they lost all their habitat. Then you go kill a few of them to eat them, and you don't have as much. But it's really, with salmon, it's very much a habitat question. There's also a climate change element, warming waters. It's not as good further south. I mean, and this isn't necessarily my specialty directly, but I was involved in Pacific Fisheries Management Council.
This is the 200 miles. What about out there further? Who owns that, and how do we make sure that it doesn't get, it's the world's resource, but how do we manage that resource?
Well, it's the typical commons question. There's the age-old example everyone uses was the sheep commons in the UK, actually, where everyone, basically all the poor were told, oh, you want sheep, go put them out on the commons, that little patch of grass. Well, everybody puts all their sheep on the same patch of grass, and there's not much grass left after a little bit. But then it creates a race for you to get the grass as fast as possible. So how do you manage the commons? And that's what we call the high seas. So that's out past 200 miles. And salmon is actually a useful example because salmon breeds in the rivers, but then it spends most of its life out on the ocean. But that fish under the international system belongs to the coastal states, the countries where it goes back to. So the North Pacific is a great example of this, where you've actually got really good cooperation. It's sort of odd bedfellows. Russia, the United States, Canada, Korea, and Japan, and then with help from China for a while, working together to eliminate a very pernicious, nasty type of fishing that was targeting salmon on the high seas for years. That started in the early 1990s, and then over about 20 years, wiped out most of the illegal fishing, protecting salmon all around the Pacific Ocean. So it's a great example, but it's really hard to do all over the world.
So as a pescatarian, the only fish I eat, of course, is wild salmon. So I'm probably contributing to this. And you've got like health people or doctors saying, wild salmon or salmon is one of the good fats, like whatever. You have it being promoted as a resource that's healthy for humans. I don't know if that's just in the United States, but and then so is there a world in which they can be protected and there's still enough, the supply demand?
Yeah, supply demand is the key piece. You hit the question on it, because with salmon in particular, wild salmon, there are huge fisheries that are totally sustainable and very well managed. It's specific runs, especially in the southern area, especially when you get down to California, where it starts to be a problem. But if you're up towards Alaska, I'm not up to date on the most recent by river, because the science is really good, and I would say the management is pretty good. But in the aggregate, our problem with fisheries is the same as functionally the rest of our food supply and the land that we use to grow our food, which is that there are more people, they are wealthier than they've ever been, and they would like to eat the same thing the rest of the rich world has got to eat for the last few hundred years. And in a world where we don't have extra fish production from wild capture, that means supply is static, demand is increasing. And basic macroeconomics says that in that scenario, the price And the impetus for you to go pull more fish out of the water is going to increase and increase. And that might be either illegal, or it might be pressure on government to say that something is legal, even if it's not sustainable, which is what you see in a lot of the world. Like there's very little incentive for governments and industry to take their foot off the accelerator with this stuff, because everybody wants to eat fish. And a lot of it's a global commodity. Some of it we grind up to feed to other fish, to feed to people in the rich world. That's how we get shrimp. That's how we get farm salmon. We're feeding them, for the most part, ground up other fish. We also feed that to pigs, all kinds of things.
So there's a lot of people doing illegal fishing, around the world, right? Can we use a satellite if we see a ship, and then follow that ship on satellite and intercept it? Like, how is technology changing this effort?
So that was one of the things that OceanMind's been working on for years, along with many other organizations, all nonprofits, it's worth noting, because governments don't get paid more to go after their own taxpayers. It's the short version. So especially when you have something that's what we call victimless crime, if somebody breaks into your house, you have one taxpayer complaining, hey, someone broke into my house, and another who's like, hey, don't harass me. In the case of an environmental crime, who's speaking on behalf of that? There's not somebody actually going to a government official saying, hey, you're missing things, except for basically some of the NGO community or some parts of industry. So it matters to be really efficient at identifying when there's problems. So that's what I've spent a lot of the last few years doing, is finding and helping build a team who can work with governments and work with industry to identify when there are problems that need to be investigated. Because it doesn't mean that you're always going to find, a picture of the bad guy doing the bad thing. What it means is it's helping you sort through a big pile of data, which is sometimes pictures from space. It's sexy, it's interesting, and people can latch onto it, but there's so many different ways. And then you identify the incidents, the times, the vessels that you just need to ask more questions. And sometimes it can be an honest mistake. Sometimes it can be intentional. If you're working with the private sector, it's about having them, supply chain, retailers and processors talk to vessel owners, be like, hey, what are you doing? What's going on here? To try and correct smaller problems before they become big. If you're working with government, it's helping them decide, okay, there were this many incidences that could have been a violation. Let's go make sure those people understood where the closed area was, what the closed season was, start with that voluntary outreach, and then work their way up to investigation and prosecution if necessary. Because for the most part, it's hard to do if you're just not using all the tools available.
But from a satellite view, you can't know how many fish are in a place, or can you? Can you see the fish in the satellite view?
It's interesting. So it's gotten a lot better over the last few years. It's one of the most interesting things I've learned, because I didn't come from the sort of satellite or the space sector to start with. I just sort of learned it as I went and talked to a lot of smart people. But you can see an awful lot. So the best satellites commercially available right now, when we think of electro-optical, which is, photographs from space, basically. A pixel is like 35 to 40 centimeters most of the time. So, about yay big. Not bigger than that, sorry. I'm still working on my imperial to centimeters conversion. So you can't necessarily see a fish on deck, but you can see a boat with gear in the water. And if you know what you're looking at, you can say, okay, that's a fishing vessel. It's engaged in fishing. Who was there from the different transponders, or do we not have a transponder for this boat? And then trying to understand who else might have been operating nearby that might have evidence. It's basically starting an investigation to understand, was that compliant activity? Because the different gear types have different rules. A trawler is different from a troller. A longliner is different from a purse seiner. So you need to look at, what the gear looked like in the water versus the rules at that place and time. And most of the time, there is someone somewhere has a transponder for that vessel, if we're talking about the industrial fleets. The smaller fleets, it's a different thing.
So you take a patch of water, you can take a picture of all the ships that are in that area, and then there's a transponder that tells you the name of that ship, and you can track where it goes. Because in the video, you're tracking a ship that's really hard to follow, right?
The bulk of the sort of non-compliance that we see, or fisheries management issues, has to do with looking at all the transponder data. And this is in the sense of, your phone follow, you can basically, if you want to, you can have your phone record where you go all day, and then you can pull it up and be like, oh, and then I went to the 7-Eleven, and then I went to a Safeway, and then I went to the Piggly Wiggly, whatever. Boats have those too. But the normal way for years that governments have made sure people were following is they just click on all the boats. And so if you've got, say, 10,000 boats or 50,000 boats in your zone, that means you have to have somebody who goes into work every day and clicks on all the dots. And so what we did when I was with OceanMind, what we still do, is use machine learning, a type of artificial intelligence, to review all of those, compare them to the regulations. And then it's like, okay, you had 8,000 boats to look at. Here's the 200 who might have done something wrong that day. Take a closer look at those.
I have a question around a bigger view, because some of the things that OceanMind we're working on, it's not just fisheries compliance. We're talking about heritage. We're talking about human rights violations. Yeah. So when you're looking at big oceans, what are some of the, really terrifying and terrible, egregious human rights violations that are going on? Because I think people don't really understand how the oceans are used to do a lot of bad stuff. It's not just bad fishing, right?
Yeah, a good friend and colleague of mine has a good saying: you can have fish caught with fair labor, you can have sustainable, or you can have cheap, but you can't have all three. And especially in the US, we just go on cheap most of the time. And then we expect everyone else to eat it on the cost. That's true for fish, that's true for corn, that's true for everything. The only thing we buy on is, for the most part, unless you're sort of well-to-do shopping at Whole Foods, most of America and most of the free world buys what's cheapest. And that leads to a lot of incentives to cut corners. And some of the corners that get cut are horrible abuses of people. That's true on farms, and that's true on boats. It can be worse on boats because there's nowhere to go. And if you complain too much and no one really knows you're there, you can just get disappeared over the side. So some bad stuff can happen. It's easier, and there's more incentives for people to not say stuff, because you're not going home to a community at the end of the day. You work on a farm, you get abused, you might be going back to a pretty miserable place to live, but it's not as frequent that you're stuck somewhere with your boss about 20 feet from you, which is the case on a lot of these fishing boats. So there's a lot of incentives. And so there are credible reports of murder, physical abuse, just a wide variety of things. And that doesn't mean it's everybody. It doesn't mean it's everywhere, but it's way more than there should be. Again, people like to separate these things out and be like, oh, it's those bad people over there. No, it's not just them. It's our desire for cheap food. It's all of us. It's the politicians we elect who design systems that encourage these things. So it's a larger system of which we are a part. And that doesn't mean there isn't anything we can do, but I think it's important to understand that the economic system is the major driver of this, not just bad actors somewhere.
You said, the mission is to make a certain type of fish sustainable. When Columbus came to America, he said he could have walked across the backs of whales to get there, and so, we don't even, how do we decide what is a normal, sort of amount that's sustainable? I know with krill in America, we've sort of fished that out for vitamins and things, sort of things like that. How do we manage these crops to, not crops, but how do we manage these fish so that it's a sustainable thing? How much abuse can go at it,
God, it's such a hard question. That's really the rub. It's one of the things I'm spending some of my time off doing, is talking with a lot of people about these kind of issues, figuring out the kind of things I want to do next, because we need to, folks like OceanMind and others paying attention to the compliance side, but also deciding what is good and making the strong case about what's good and what's not, and helping everybody else understand it. Because you can cut it 6 ways to Sunday. There is always someone who can put together an argument that something is good enough. But my entering argument, and where I've gotten to, where a lot of my friends and colleagues have gotten to over the last few years, comes back to what I said before. There's more of us. We're richer, and we want to eat and live the same way we did before, but we're burning through the resources. And that doesn't mean we're burning through all the resources. Some of the stuff is doing pretty well, but a lot of it's not. And the trend line on a lot of it is, you can draw this across fisheries, you can draw it across topsoil, groundwater for agriculture. If you look out, next time you're on a plane, which, frankly, we shouldn't be because of climate change, you look out the window, try and find some soil somewhere that hasn't been turned over a few times by humans. The oceans are a lot like the same way. We think of this, it's still a huge wild harvest, but a lot of the most valuable sections of ocean have already been turned over several times. It's just the fish are some of them are able to reproduce fast enough to come back. And we're not keeping up with how fast the demand is increasing. You talked about the high seas and where that's difficult, but the bulk of the production, the bulk of the fishing is actually in the coastal zones. That's countries most Americans couldn't find on the map, where somebody pays somebody to go fish for something that used to be a primary food, and then we grind it up and go feed it to shrimp in a pond on another part of the world so that we can have, frozen cocktail shrimp whenever we want. That's the kind of question where it's just like, all right, can we do this? I think we can, but everything just requires more management and sort of a careful determination of what's good enough. Because most of this stuff, we're not putting back. The world ain't going to what it was when the Pilgrims showed up, when the indigenous first came to North America, indigenous populations even. It's like, what is the baseline population that we're supposed to say is sustainable? So for the most part, we use pre-industrial use. So early 20th century. Mid 20th century is kind of what we go off of. But even if you do that, most of the major fish stocks are just a pittance of what they were at that point. All of the culturally iconic species, especially on the East Coast, I grew up Chesapeake Bay, blue crab, oysters, up and down, they are a pittance of what they were in the late 19th century. You couldn't sail up the Chesapeake without running aground on oyster reefs. We fish them out. We get a tiny little 5% increase in population. Well, that's against the 99% loss over the last 100 years. Right. I'm messing up the numbers there. So if somebody hears this, it gives me a quibble, they can send me
I want to ask you, when we're looking at this big problem, you're looking at the oceans, we're trying an alternative, but now because of the climate crisis and all of the other regulations that we're not adhering to, is, what are the alternatives? Like, are we going to go up in space and make fish? Like, what do we do?
So first off, actually, let's talk about the positive. There is a tremendous amount of ocean space where we can grow some good stuff out there. Oysters, seaweed, a lot of the bivalves, they clean water as they go through. There are a lot of species that we could grow that are low trophic level, low on the food chain, that would be are great. And most of the increased fisheries production in the world, like more fish that we've captured, so to speak, has been from aquaculture. It's actually mostly Chinese carp. The Chinese are just growing carp hand over fist, but Americans don't want to eat stuff. We barely like catfish. I'm sure plenty of people in the South like catfish, but it's not at the highest end of what Americans consume for the most part. We like eating carnivorous stuff, and that's our problem. We are things that need to be fed protein. So I would say targeting farm, it is absolutely possible to farm seafood sustainably. 100%, as much as you can do. We got to turn over soil and turn over water to get calories into us, or else we die. What are we going to do it with? That's the question. So something's going to get disturbed out in the world. And so I wouldn't say that wild capture fisheries, they should absolutely be a part of that. We should be aiming low trophic level, if anything. I would say going for direct consumption. So actually eat anchovies and sardines. I eat anchovy, sardine, and mackerel. They're pretty good. And they're tasty too. But again, most Americans
in Italy, they're really good, those sardines, but I've never been able to find them here. They're so delicious the way they fry them up.
Yeah, exactly. Squid as well. So I would say there's ways to do all of those things.
So say you're looking at a satellite and there's a fishing boat in Macau, and it looks like it's, there's nobody around except the satellite, but it appears as if they're really fishing something out. But then the ship sails to Korea, you still know where it is. How do you, it happened on the open seas. How do you direct resources towards it? Because, where is the crime actually committed?
Yeah, there's a few ways to come at this. You always think about jurisdiction in law enforcement. And when we're talking about fisheries, three primary ones we want to think about are the coastal state. So was it a country's waters? The flag state, whose boat was it? A lot of times those two are the same thing. And then the port state, which is where the product comes off the boat and goes into production or gets reprocessed and sent somewhere else. There are legal means for all three of those different countries, if they are different countries, to intervene. And so it's about finding the countries that want to lean into it and deal with it. You've got things like what are called the Port State Measures Agreement, which lets countries, if the fish is coming from somewhere else on a vessel that's not their flag, that lets them say, nope, you're not allowed to come in here, or you can come in, but we're going to investigate you further to help do this. But all of these things are hard. Again, governments don't really have an impetus to do this as much. A few governments do, but not as many as we want. This is where the private sector matters too, because retailers, processors can be asking the same questions. And there are so many different mechanisms in place, making sure that they're asking for the compliance reports, actually saying, hey, show me that a good inspection was done here, which is something a lot of organizations don't do yet. A lot of companies don't do. But that kind of mandatory due diligence is something I'm a big fan of, especially when there's an international shipment of some kind. Make the companies prove that they checked that it was legally harvested or caught, whether or not we're talking about timber, fish, anything else. And then also show the state of the workers who are involved in it. That's more cost to the private sector, but it's how we level the playing field. And quite honestly, when we've got this much constrained resource, this many people, and we suck through our, we talk about this idea of how fast can the earth regenerate itself. There's really interesting studies about this. We suck through about a year's worth of earth, usually in about 8 months every year. So we're just burning through all of our resources faster than they can replenish. So we got to shift the onus onto the supply side to say, nope, show that this was sustainable, show that this was legal, show that your workers were treated fairly. We've got to enhance the oversight that we're doing here. If, business as usual ain't going to cut it.
So timber, you can see that the tree is gone. How do you measure that the fish is gone? And is that the role of nonprofits, the verification part? Because how do we verify it was caught sustainably? How can we?
Yeah. Well, even with timber, it's hard because, the Earth's pretty big. There's a lot of land out there. So saying that tree showed up from right there, what are you going to do? Walk out in the forest and measure every single one of them? So timber and fisheries actually have a lot of similar issues. It's really interesting because the two communities don't talk very much, but there's a lot of overlap between them in terms of the types of approaches. I think when we talk about this due diligence side, this is a lot of what OceanMind was doing, some other orgs as well. I wish there were even more organizations who did it. There needs to be more third-party validation. People who don't have an incentive to say everything is fine because they're not paid to do that. They're paid to say, tell me if this was good or bad, and it's independent. Finding ways to make nonprofits financially sustainable or just social enterprises who have the ethics that come first to make sure that somebody's helping the businesses who want to do the right thing check, because otherwise your incentives just always end up to be like, this is difficult, make that go away, move that through, let's not hold this up.
I mean, how would you even approach it with fishing? I mean, like if I'm in Alaska and I'm off the coast and I catch a bunch of salmon and where's the verification? Is it on the boat or is it in the dock? And if it's in the dock, doesn't that allow a lot of abuse?
So this is a lot of what I helped set up at OceanMind, was a lot of this kind of work for retailers and processors around the world. You don't need to do it in real time all the time, because the boat, the fish has to come off the boat at some point. So you can review, a week, a month's worth of activity at a go, and then be like, hey, let's ask a question here, or just keep a watching eye on what a boat's doing. And then you see them just sort of dipping into a closed area. You talk to the processor and you be like, hey, can you talk to them? They'll of course say, well, the government didn't say anything was wrong, but government doesn't say everybody follows the rules. Government says when people break the rules, but a lot of folks act as if I wasn't prosecuted, I'm innocent until proven guilty. Well, that's how we want our legal system to work, but that doesn't work well if our problem, is everybody skirting the rules in a way that doesn't get caught, but ends up with a big problem of unsustainable or illegality. So having the kind of verification, which is actually saying, hey, this all looked legit, leave it to government to decide the letter of the law, but having third-party organizations look at the spirit of the law and work collaboratively with industry. I mean, I'll be honest, nobody likes somebody looking over their shoulder on this stuff, but you know what? Home builders don't like it when surveyors show up, or inspectors, we don't like it when the bank checks our credit, but yet we do these things. Banks don't give us a mortgage without checking how we've been throughout our life. But, we've said that this is too high of a risk. We want an independent validation that the home we're going to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars for is actually worth the money we're spending on it before we get a loan. This is the same thing.
Can you give a little bit more, you talked a little bit about what is possible and some of the positive work that's going on, like seaweed, what are some of the kind of visionary things that are happening out there we've talked, Jesse and I've talked to, people that are talking about farms under the ocean and, going down there and sustainability. And like, what are things that you're sort of excited about that can counteract all of the transgressions that are happening? Like what's positive and that you're thinking about or you're learning about in your travels?
Yeah. The due diligence laws are an interesting one to talk with folks about. Sort of what does it mean to mandate this, not just for companies that are leading on the front, but to say everybody for all certain classes coming across borders. The EU is looking at a law that would require that systematically, which is really interesting. When it comes to production and making good stuff, I'm really excited about really scaling up seaweed and the bivalves, mussels and oysters, especially. People don't think about eating seaweed a lot, but we've got a huge demand for growing materials for all kinds of industrial uses. We can fill up a lot of that usage with seaweed, which is, that's basically free energy we can harvest out there. It's like the grass of the sea in a lot of different ways. The bivalves really helps us deal with what you call eutrophication, which is where we dump all these excess nutrients into the water. There's a giant dead zone off of Louisiana because all of the fertilizer we dump across the Great Plains in the Mississippi River Basin washes off with some of that topsoil, comes down, goes in, and now the algae, when it gets exposed to that nitrogen and phosphorus, just explodes. And when that population grows and then it dies, it sucks the oxygen out of the water and it kills everything. Chesapeake Bay has this every summer, parts of Puget Sound, it's a phenomenon that's gotten worse. Bivalves, because they're filter feeders, they eat that algae. So they're helping filter that out. So as we've encouraged farming of these, especially in nearshore zones, we're helping solve some of this problem while we try and change our land use laws. One of the downsides is that people living on the shoreline, who are mostly rich, don't like seeing people working out in their view shed. So we've got a zoning problem because rich people along the shore, when we're subsidizing their flood insurance already, don't like it when people go work sort of in the water off their yard. So that's a problem, but I think that's a surmountable one. And I'm really excited for that growth in the aquaculture sector, especially.
Now, you've been working on these issues for a long time, and you've recently left your organization that you founded. What's next?
I've decided to take a few months off, and right now it's a lot of having conversations with people I respect and looking at the different opportunities. I'm thinking more broadly about food systems. Actually, you can probably hear that in some of what I'm talking about. These issues aren't unique to fish. And along those lines, thinking also about the crossover with timber and the crossover with agriculture, especially when it comes to due diligence, when it comes to sustainable systems. Been working and talking to some local organic farmers around here as well. But, looking at all ends of it from, production level all the way up to the retailers and as well as the NGOs. But in the meantime, getting some chickens this weekend to raise them in the backyard for some primary production of our own, and working on some cabinets in the kitchen.
Oh, nice. Are you permanently going to move to the UK? And also, are there attitudes different, in terms of this work? Is there anything you noticeably different?
Yeah, so I'm a permanent resident now. So I have what's called green card, and I'm actually just starting my citizenship application process as well. I really like it over here, own a house.
You're gonna have an accent soon. We'll have to.
Yeah, if they haven't had me in 7 years, they ain't getting me anytime soon. So it is interesting, the different attitudes. The UK especially is an interesting one because they're probably, from a retail perspective, one of the most conscientious retail industries for food in the world. But it's not because they like better quality product. They had a really bad scandal a couple decades ago. They call it the horse meat scandal, where it turned out a horse was ended up in other meats because of some problems in supply chain. Yeah. And, that's a value judgment that, Anglos, for the most part, those of us, living in English-speaking countries have, that horses are not food, but, other, ungulates and other, things that walk on four legs are. But they had a huge freak out because they, think as highly of horses as Americans do a bit culturally. And so they just have a tremendous amount of due diligence and attention to this. Some are better than others, but it's much higher than you would see in the United States, I would say, systematically. And then I would say the other European countries sort of shortly behind them, but that's more on a quality range and a diversity of option range rather than on a due diligence range. Especially when we're talking about seafood, you know, the French, the Spanish, the Italians, they like a lot of stuff. They like it fresh. They like it from all around the world, which causes its own problems, but they're very sort of much more demanding, which, you know, not slagging, but that's just sort of, you know, you go into a supermarket in America and you're finding the same 5 products pretty much.
Yeah.
Bradley, thank you so much for spending time with us and all the great work you've already been doing. Seems like you're going to continue to do.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me on. Hope this was interesting and useful.
Yeah, it's great.
Ramblings.
Yeah, it's great. Thank you very much.
Here's the deal. Vegetarian, vegan from now on. Jesse, I guess well, you're a trendsetter.
I'm vegetarian.
I understand. You've been the trendsetter, but I do think it's such a vast problem to solve. But I mean, I have to look at my part of it because I do live on fish. That is my entire diet, basically. Anyway, moderation is the key. We all need to be aesthetics. Is that the word? We don't need a lot.
Yeah.
We need very little.
Okay.
See you later.
Talk to you later.